Portland, Oregon, December 2006. The city was draped in its typical winter gloom, with rain hammering against windows and streets glistening under the pale glow of streetlights. For most residents, it was just another cold evening in the Pacific Northwest. But for Elena Hartman, that night would mark the moment her entire world collapsed. Elena was 34 years old, a high school English teacher at Roosevelt High School in Northeast Portland. Colleagues described her as dedicated, organized, and remarkably composed. She had been married to Derek Hartman for 7 years. To everyone who knew them, they seemed like an ordinary couple. Derek worked as an IT technician for a regional healthcare provider, a job that required him to travel occasionally to different clinics throughout Oregon and Washington. He was quiet, methodical, and kept mostly to himself. Neighbors rarely saw him, and when they did, he offered little more than a polite nod. The Hartmans lived in a modest 2-story house on the eastern edge of the city, in a neighborhood where families knew each other by name and children played in front yards during summer months. Their home was unremarkable from the outside, painted a faded blue with white trim, surrounded by overgrown hedges that Derek never seemed to find time to maintain. Inside, the house reflected Elena's touch more than his. Bookshelves lined the living room walls filled with classic literature and teaching materials. The kitchen was tidy, the furniture simple but comfortable. It was the kind of home that suggested stability, routine, predictability. On the evening of December 14th, Elena arrived home around 6 in the evening after staying late to grade essays. Derek had called earlier that day to say he would be working late, troubleshooting network issues at a clinic in Beaverton. This was not unusual. His job often demanded irregular hours, and Elena had grown accustomed to spending evenings alone. She made herself dinner, a simple pasta dish, and settled into the living room with a stack of student papers. Around 8:30, she noticed a faint smell of dampness rising from the basement. The house had ongoing issues with moisture during the rainy season, and Elena had been meaning to check the dehumidifier for days. She descended the wooden stairs into the unfinished basement, a space Derek used primarily for storage. Boxes were stacked against concrete walls, labeled with black marker in Derek's neat handwriting. Old electronics, holiday decorations, tax documents from previous years. The dehumidifier was running, but the reservoir was full. Elena emptied it into a nearby utility sink. As she turned to head back upstairs, her foot caught on something protruding from beneath a workbench in the corner. She crouched down to investigate and found a cardboard box that had been shoved far back against the wall, partially hidden by a drop cloth. The box was unmarked, sealed with packing tape that had yellowed with age. Curious, Elena pulled it out into the light. It was heavier than she expected. She peeled back the tape and opened the flaps. Inside were VHS tapes, dozens of them, stacked in no particular order. Each tape had a white label affixed to its spine, marked with dates and initials. The dates ranged from 2003 to 2005. The initials meant nothing to Elena at first. IC, NV, PG. She picked up one of the tapes, turning it over in her hands. There was nothing else written on it, no indication of what the content might be. For a moment, she considered simply closing the box and returning it to its hiding place. But something about the deliberate concealment unsettled her. Elena carried the box upstairs and placed it on the coffee table in the living room. The television in their bedroom had a built-in VCR, an older model Derek had insisted on keeping despite the shift to DVDs and digital media. She selected one of the tapes at random, dated April 2003, initialed IC. Her hands trembled slightly as she inserted the tape and pressed play. The screen flickered to black, then displayed a grainy image. It took Elena several seconds to understand what she was seeing. The footage was shot from a fixed angle, looking down into what appeared to be a dimly lit basement or storage room. The walls were bare concrete. A single overhead bulb cast harsh shadows, and then a woman appeared in the frame. She was bound, her face streaked with tears, eyes wide with terror. Elena's breath caught in her throat. The woman was pleading, her voice muffled but audible through the television speakers. The camera did not move. Whoever was filming remained silent. Elena's first instinct was disbelief. This had to be some kind of mistake, perhaps footage from a movie or a news report Derek had recorded for some inexplicable reason. But as the tape continued, that fragile explanation crumbled. The woman on screen was not acting. Her fear was visceral, raw, undeniable. And then Derek entered the frame. Elena recognized him immediately, even though his back was to the camera. The way he moved, the shape of his shoulders, the slight limp in his left leg from an old knee injury. It was him. She stopped the tape. Her heart was pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. For several minutes she sat frozen on the edge of the bed, staring at the paused image on the screen. Then, driven by a need to confirm what she had just witnessed, she ejected the tape and inserted another. This one was dated September 2004, initialed NV, the same type of footage. A different woman, the same basement, the same figure moving through the frame. Derek. Elena went through 4 more tapes. Each one documented a similar scenario. Different women, different dates, but the same horrifying pattern. The recordings were methodical, almost clinical in their presentation. There was no audio commentary, no explanation, just footage of crimes being committed. Crimes that, based on the women's reactions and the cold efficiency of the recordings, were very real. By the time Elena finished watching the 4th tape, it was nearly midnight. Derek still had not come home. She sat in the living room, the box of tapes at her feet, trying to process what she had just discovered. Her mind raced through possibilities, explanations, justifications, but none of them held. The man she had shared a bed with for 7 years, the man she had trusted completely, was a stranger. Worse than a stranger. A predator. A killer. Elena's first thought was to call the police. She reached for her phone, then hesitated. What would she say? What would happen next? Derek would be arrested, certainly. There would be an investigation, a trial, media attention. Her life would be dissected, scrutinized. People would ask how she could not have known. They would wonder if she had been complicit, if she had suspected something and turned a blind eye. The weight of those future judgments pressed down on her, suffocating. But more than the fear of public judgment was the immediate, primal fear for her own safety. If Derek had done these things to other women, what would he do if he discovered she knew? The house suddenly felt like a trap. Every creak of the old wooden floors made her flinch. She checked the time. 12:45 in the morning. Derek could return at any moment. Elena made a decision. She could not stay in that house. Not tonight. Not until she figured out what to do. She grabbed her purse, her car keys, and a small overnight bag she hastily packed with clothes and toiletries. She left the box of tapes on the coffee table, evidence of what she had found, and walked out the front door into the cold December rain. Her car, a silver Honda Accord, was parked in the driveway. She started the engine and pulled out onto the empty street, driving with no clear destination in mind. She just needed to get away, to put distance between herself and the house, between herself and Derek. She drove west toward downtown Portland, then south along the Willamette River, the city lights blurred by rain and tears. At some point during that long, aimless drive, Elena's phone rang. Derek's name appeared on the screen. She stared at it, her hand hovering over the answer button, but she could not bring herself to pick up. The call went to voicemail. A minute later, he called again, and then a third time. Elena turned off her phone. She checked into a budget motel on the outskirts of the city, paying cash and using a false name. The clerk barely looked at her. The room was small and smelled faintly of cigarette smoke despite the no smoking sign on the door. Elena locked herself inside, sat on the edge of the bed, and tried to think. She needed to go to the police. She knew that. But every time she reached for her phone to turn it back on, fear paralyzed her. Hours passed. Dawn broke over Portland, pale and gray. Elena had not slept. She sat by the window, watching the parking lot as cars came and went. She replayed the images from the tapes in her mind, over and over, each time hoping she had misunderstood, that there was some explanation she had missed. But there was none. By mid-morning, she made another decision. She would not go to the police. Not yet. First, she needed to disappear. She needed time to think, to plan, to figure out how to protect herself. She checked out of the motel and drove north, crossing into Washington State. She withdrew cash from several ATMs along the way, careful not to take out too much from any single location. She stopped at a thrift store and bought plain, nondescript clothing. She found another motel, this one in a small town she had never heard of, and checked in under a different false name. Meanwhile, back in Portland, Derek Hartman returned home that morning to find the house empty. Elena's car was gone. Her phone went straight to voicemail. At first, he assumed she had left early for work or perhaps gone to visit a friend. But when she did not show up at Roosevelt High School that day, and when she failed to return his calls, concern began to creep in. By the evening of December 15th, he filed a missing persons report with the Portland Police Bureau. 2 days later, when Elena still had not appeared and her colleagues confirmed she had not been seen since the 14th, the case was assigned to Detective Marcus Brennan, a veteran investigator with the Bureau's Major Crimes Unit. Brennan began with standard procedure, interviewing Derek, checking Elena's financial records, speaking with friends and family. Derek presented himself as a worried husband, cooperative, and forthcoming. He explained that Elena had been under stress at work, that she had mentioned feeling overwhelmed. He suggested she might have needed time alone to clear her head, but as Brennan dug deeper, inconsistencies began to emerge, and when officers conducted a routine search of the Hartman residence, they found the box of VHS tapes sitting in plain view on the living room coffee table. What Elena Hartman had discovered that December night was about to become the center of one of the most disturbing criminal investigations in Portland's history. The question that would haunt investigators for weeks was not just what Derek Hartman had done, it was what had happened to Elena after she walked out that door, and whether she was still alive. Detective Marcus Brennan had spent 23 years with the Portland Police Bureau, the last 12 in major crimes. He had worked homicides, assaults, kidnappings. He thought he had seen everything the city could offer in terms of human depravity. But when he walked into the Hartman residence on the morning of December 18, 2006, what he found would challenge even his experienced perspective. The initial missing persons report had seemed routine. A wife disappears after what the husband describes as a normal day. No history of domestic violence, no financial problems, no apparent marital discord. These cases usually resolve themselves within 72 hours. The missing person turned up at a relative's house or checked into a hotel to take a break from daily pressures. But Elena Hartman's case had unusual elements from the start. Her colleagues at Roosevelt High School reported that she had been completely reliable, never missing a day without notice. Her lesson plans for the following week were already prepared and sitting on her desk. Her grade book was up to date. Everything suggested she had intended to return to work the next day. Her parents, who lived in Seattle, had not heard from her. Her sister in California had received no calls. Elena's bank account showed no activity after December 14th. Her credit cards were unused. Her phone had been turned off and never turned back on. When Brennan and his partner, Detective Sarah Chen, arrived at the Hartman house to conduct a more thorough search, Derek was waiting for them. He appeared exhausted, his eyes red-rimmed, his clothes wrinkled. He had taken time off work to assist with the search efforts. He walked the detectives through the house, pointing out that nothing seemed to be missing except Elena herself and some of her personal belongings. Her car was gone, a small suitcase, some clothes, her purse and phone. It was Chen who noticed the box on the coffee table. She asked Derek about it. He glanced at it, then looked away quickly. Too quickly. He said he had no idea where it came from, that it must have been something Elena had brought up from the basement. Brennan asked if they could examine the contents. Derek hesitated, then nodded. He said he had not looked inside it himself. That hesitation was the first red flag. Brennan lifted one of the VHS tapes from the box, noting the date and initials. He asked Derek if he recognized the handwriting. Derek said it might be his, but he could not remember what the tapes contained. Old home videos, perhaps. Things he had recorded years ago. Brennan asked if they could view one of the tapes. Derek said he supposed that would be fine, though his voice carried a note of uncertainty. They used the VCR in the bedroom. Brennan selected the tape dated April 2003. He inserted it and pressed play. What appeared on the screen made both detectives go rigid. Chen immediately stopped the tape after less than 30 seconds. She looked at Derek, whose face had gone pale. He stammered that he had never seen that footage before, that someone must have put those tapes in his house without his knowledge. The explanation was weak and unconvincing. Brennan made a decision. He asked Derek to come down to the precinct for further questioning. He informed him that the house was now a potential crime scene and would need to be processed by forensic teams. Derek protested at first, insisting he had done nothing wrong, but ultimately agreed to cooperate. He rode in the back of an unmarked police car to the downtown precinct, while Chen coordinated with the forensic unit to secure the residence. At the precinct, Derek was placed in an interview room. Brennan read him his rights. Derek declined to request an attorney, claiming he had nothing to hide. The interview began at 2 p.m. and continued for nearly 6 hours. During that time, Derek's story shifted multiple times. First, he claimed the tapes were not his. Then he suggested they might be part of research material he had collected for a true crime project he had considered writing about. When pressed on specifics, he could provide no details about this alleged project. Finally, When confronted with the fact that he appeared in some of the footage, he fell silent and requested a lawyer. While Derek sat in the interview room waiting for his attorney to arrive, forensic technicians were methodically processing the Hartman house. They started with the basement where Elena had found the box of tapes. The space was divided into two sections. The front half contained general storage, boxes of old belongings, seasonal items, typical household overflow. But the back section, behind a wooden workbench and partially concealed by hanging plastic sheeting, revealed something far more disturbing. There was a small room, roughly 10 feet by 12 feet, with concrete walls and a concrete floor. A single metal chair sat bolted to the floor in the center of the space. Heavy-duty eye hooks were screwed into the ceiling beams. The walls showed scrape marks and stains that would later be confirmed as biological material. Most significantly, mounted in one corner near the ceiling was a video camera on a fixed tripod, aimed directly at the chair. The camera was an older model, the kind that recorded directly onto VHS tapes. It was still plugged into a power outlet. Forensic teams photographed every inch of that room. They collected samples from the walls, the floor, the chair. They documented the camera setup, noting the angle and positioning matched exactly what had been seen in the tapes. They found cleaning supplies stored in a cabinet along one wall, industrial-strength bleach, heavy-duty trash bags, rubber gloves. Everything pointed to a space designed for one purpose and one purpose only. Back at the precinct, Brennan received updates from the forensic team via phone. The evidence was overwhelming. This was not a mistake, not a misunderstanding, not something that could be explained away. Derek Hartman had created a space in his own home to commit violent crimes, and he had recorded them methodically. The next step was identifying the victims in the tapes. There were 18 tapes in total. Brennan assigned a team of detectives to begin the painstaking process of reviewing each one, documenting details that might help identify the women, physical descriptions, any visible tattoos or distinguishing marks, pieces of clothing, anything the women said that might provide clues. It was grim work, and several officers requested breaks during the viewing process. By December 20th, 48 hours after the tapes were discovered, the team had made progress. 3 of the women had been tentatively identified by comparing the footage to missing persons cases filed in Oregon and Washington between 2003 and 2005. The first was Iris Coleman, a 26-year-old woman who had disappeared from Eugene, Oregon, in April 2003 after leaving her shift at a grocery store. The second was Nora Vance, 32, who vanished from her apartment in Tacoma, Washington in September 2004. The third was Pauline Grant, 29, last seen in Portland in March 2005, after meeting someone she had connected with through an online chat room. All 3 cases had been investigated at the time but had gone cold due to lack of evidence or leads. Now, suddenly, they were connected by the tapes found in Derek Hartman's basement. Detectives pulled the original case files and began comparing details. Iris Coleman had worked at a grocery store that was serviced by the healthcare network Derek worked for. Security footage from the store showed Derek had been there on the day she disappeared, performing routine maintenance on their computer systems. Nora Vance had lived in an apartment complex where Derek had been dispatched for network troubleshooting 2 days before she vanished. The connections were not coincidental. The Portland Police Bureau held a press conference on December 22nd. They announced that Derek Hartman, 37, had been arrested and charged with multiple counts including kidnapping, assault, and homicide. They released the names of the 3 identified victims and asked the public for any information regarding their disappearances. They also made a public appeal for Elena Hartman to come forward, stating that she was considered a potential witness and not a suspect. The media response was immediate and intense. News outlets across the Pacific Northwest picked up the story. Derek's photo appeared on television screens and newspaper front pages. Reporters camped outside the Hartman house, now cordoned off with police tape. Neighbors were interviewed, all expressing shock and disbelief. Derek had been so quiet, so unassuming. No one had suspected anything. But the question that dominated coverage was the same one that haunted Brennan's investigation. Where was Elena Hartman? Had she discovered the tapes and fled in fear? Or had Derek done something to her before his arrest? Searches were organized in the forests and rural areas surrounding Portland, places where Derek was known to have traveled for work. Cadaver dogs were brought in. Divers searched sections of the Willamette and Columbia rivers. Nothing was found. Derek's attorney, a public defender named Roger Walsh, advised his client to remain silent. Derek followed that advice. He provided no information about Elena's whereabouts. He refused to discuss the tapes or the room in his basement. He entered a plea of not guilty at his arraignment, though the evidence against him was staggering. As the investigation entered its third week, Brennan faced a troubling reality. They had enough evidence to charge Derek Hartman with multiple serious crimes. But without finding Elena, without understanding what had happened to her on that December night, a crucial piece of the puzzle remained missing, and time was running out to find her alive. The work of connecting Derek Hartman to his victims became the focal point of the investigation. As December gave way to January 2007, Detective Brennan assembled a task force that included investigators from Eugene and Tacoma, jurisdictions where two of the victims had disappeared. The team worked around the clock, building a timeline of Derek's movements and cross-referencing them with the disappearances documented on the tapes. Iris Coleman had been the first victim, taken in April 2003. She was a college student working part-time at a grocery store in Eugene to pay for her education. On the evening of April 16th, she finished her shift at 9 and walked to her car in the employee parking lot behind the store. Security cameras captured her leaving through the back door, but her car was found the next morning still parked in the same spot. She had never made it home. Her family had reported her missing immediately, launching a search that yielded nothing. No witnesses, no physical evidence, no leads. The case had eventually gone cold. Now investigators pulled Derek Hartman's work records from the healthcare network that employed him. On April 16, 2003, he had been dispatched to that exact grocery store to repair a malfunctioning network router in the pharmacy department. He had signed in at 7 in the evening and signed out at 8:45, just 15 minutes before Iris finished her shift. Store employees remembered him as quiet and professional. No one had noticed anything unusual, but the timing was impossible to ignore. Forensic teams went back to the grocery store, now 4 years after the incident, and searched the parking lot and surrounding areas with new purpose. They found nothing of immediate evidential value, but they did locate the pharmacy's old security tapes archived in a storage room. The footage showed Derek working at a computer terminal, his back to the camera. At one point, he stood and walked toward the front of the store, disappearing from view for approximately 12 minutes. When he returned, he completed his work and left. Those 12 minutes placed him in the store at the exact time Iris would have been finishing her shift. Detectives interviewed former co-workers who had been present that evening. One pharmacy technician recalled that Derek had asked to use the employee restroom, which required walking through the back corridors of the store, the same corridors that led to the employee exit, the same exit Iris Coleman had used. The second victim, Nora Vance, had disappeared from Tacoma in September 2004. She was a dental hygienist who lived alone in a modest apartment complex on the south side of the city. On September 23rd, she had called in sick to work, complaining of a stomach illness. When she failed to show up for her shift 2 days later and did not answer repeated phone calls, her supervisor contacted police. Officers found her apartment unlocked, her purse and keys inside, but no sign of Nora. Her car was in the parking garage. There were no signs of struggle. Derek's work records showed he had been sent to that same apartment complex on September 21st to address network connectivity issues reported by the building management. He had accessed the server room located in the basement and had been given a master key to check network outlets in several units, including one directly below Nora's apartment. Residents who were home that day remembered seeing a technician moving through the hallways with equipment, but no one had paid close attention. Investigators theorized that Derek had used his legitimate access to survey the building, identify potential victims, and plan his approach. Nora had called in sick 2 days after his visit. The timing suggested he might have returned to the building on his own time, possibly gaining entry by posing as maintenance staff, a role that would not have raised suspicion. He could have knocked on her door claiming there was a follow-up issue with the network. She would have let him in without hesitation. The third identified victim was Pauline Grant, who had vanished from Portland in March 2005. Pauline had been more trusting than most, meeting people through online chat rooms at a time when such platforms were still relatively new and unregulated. She had told friends she was planning to meet someone she had connected with online, someone who claimed to work in the tech industry. She left her apartment on March 11th and never returned. Her body had never been found. Her family had suspected from the beginning that the online connection had been involved, but police had been unable to trace the account she had been communicating with. Digital forensics specialists now examined Derek Hartman's old computers, seized from his home during the search. They found evidence that he had used multiple online personas, creating fake profiles on various chat platforms. One account matched the username Pauline had mentioned to her friends before she disappeared. The messages recovered from Derek's hard drive showed weeks of communication between him and Pauline, conversations where he presented himself as a lonely tech worker looking for companionship. He had suggested they meet at a coffee shop in Northeast Portland. Pauline had agreed. Security footage from nearby businesses, archived and nearly forgotten, was retrieved and reviewed. Grainy images showed a woman matching Pauline's description entering the coffee shop on March 11th. Approximately 30 minutes later, she left with a man whose build and posture matched Derek Hartman. They walked together toward the parking lot. That was the last confirmed sighting of Pauline Grant. As the task force pieced together these cases, a pattern emerged. Derek Hartman was methodical and patient. He used his job to gain access to locations and identify potential victims. He researched their routines, learned their vulnerabilities. He approached them in ways that seemed non-threatening, often leveraging his professional role or creating false pretenses online. Once he had isolated them, he transported them to his home, to that room in his basement, and he recorded everything. The tapes themselves were difficult evidence to process. Each one documented hours of footage, and while detectives focused on identifying victims and gathering evidence, they had to balance the need for thorough investigation with the psychological toll on those reviewing the material. Counseling services were made available to all task force members. Several officers rotated out of the assignment, unable to continue. Beyond the 3 identified victims, there were 15 additional tapes. The women in those recordings had not yet been matched to missing persons cases. Some of the footage was older, dating back to 2001. This suggested Derek's crimes had been ongoing for at least 5 years, possibly longer. The task force expanded their search, pulling missing persons reports from across the Pacific Northwest, comparing physical descriptions and timelines. Forensic analysis of the basement room provided additional evidence. Luminol testing revealed extensive blood spatter that had been cleaned but remained detectable at a microscopic level. DNA samples were collected and sent for processing. The metal chair showed signs of repeated use and wear. Scratch marks on the concrete floor suggested something heavy had been dragged across it multiple times. Tool marks on the walls indicated Derek had made modifications to the space over time, adding reinforcements and soundproofing materials. The investigation also examined Derek's background more thoroughly. He had grown up in rural Montana, the only child of parents who had both passed away by the time he was 30. He had attended community college, studying computer science, and had worked a series of IT jobs before moving to Portland in 2001. Former employers described him as competent but unremarkable. He had no criminal record prior to his arrest. No history of violence, nothing that would have raised red flags. Psychologists consulted by the prosecution suggested Derek fit the profile of an organized offender, someone who planned meticulously, controlled his impulses in public, and maintained a facade of normalcy. The recordings indicated he derived satisfaction not just from the acts themselves but from documenting them, reviewing them, maintaining a collection. This suggested a level of detachment and narcissism consistent with certain personality disorders. By late January 2007, the case against Derek Hartman was solid on 3 counts of first-degree murder, with additional charges likely as more victims were identified. But the question of Elena's fate remained unanswered. Prosecutors knew that without her testimony, without understanding what she had witnessed and how she had escaped, their case was missing a critical component. Defense attorneys could argue that Elena had been complicit, that she had helped Derek, that her disappearance indicated guilt rather than victimhood. Brennan refused to accept that theory. Everything they had learned about Elena suggested she had been unaware of her husband's crimes. Her colleagues, friends, and family all described her as kind, ethical, and deeply committed to her students. There was no evidence she had ever visited that basement room, no trace of her DNA in the space. The most logical explanation was that she had discovered the tapes by accident, realized the danger she was in, and fled. But where had she gone? And why had she not contacted police? Those questions kept Brennan awake at night, driving him to continue searching even as weeks turned into months. Somewhere out there, Elena Hartman was either hiding or already dead. The investigation needed to find out which. 6 weeks had passed since Elena Hartman disappeared into the cold December night. The investigation had made significant progress in building a case against Derek, but the mystery of Elena's whereabouts had become a source of growing frustration for the task force. Detective Brennan had pursued every possible lead, checked every motel within a 100-mile radius, reviewed surveillance footage from bus stations and airports. Nothing had surfaced. It was as if Elena had simply vanished. Then, on January 26, 2007, a break came from an unexpected source. A financial analyst assigned to review Elena's bank records noticed something that previous investigators had missed. There had been no activity on her primary checking account since December 14th, the day she disappeared. Her credit cards remained unused. But Elena had maintained a separate savings account, one that predated her marriage to Derek, an account he likely did not know existed. On January 18th, a withdrawal of $300 had been made from an ATM in Olympia, Washington. Brennan received the information at 9 in the morning. By 10, he and Detective Chen were in a car heading north toward Washington State. The ATM was located outside a convenience store on the eastern edge of Olympia, about 2 hours from Portland. They arrived by noon and immediately requested surveillance footage from the store owner. The camera covering the ATM had captured a woman making the withdrawal on January 18th at approximately 4 in the afternoon. The image quality was poor. The woman wore a hooded jacket and kept her face angled away from the camera, but Chen recognized the build and posture. It was Elena. The discovery changed everything. Elena was alive. She had been hiding for over a month, moving carefully, avoiding detection. Brennan studied the footage repeatedly, looking for any clues about where she might be staying. In the background of one frame, partially visible through the convenience store window, was a reflection of a silver sedan parked at the gas pumps. It matched the description of Elena's Honda Accord. Brennan contacted the Olympia Police Department and requested assistance. They needed to canvass the area, check motels, ask questions, but they had to move carefully. If word got out that police were actively searching for Elena in Olympia, she might run again. Brennan emphasized that Elena was not a suspect, but a witness who might be traumatized and frightened. The approach needed to be sensitive. Local officers began a quiet investigation. They visited motels within a 10-mile radius of the ATM, showing a photo of Elena to front desk staff. Most reported seeing dozens of guests each week and could not remember anyone specific. But on the third day of the search, a clerk at a small, rundown motel called the Motor Lodge Inn recognized her. The woman in the photo had checked in 3 weeks earlier, paying cash weekly, using the name Sarah Mitchell. She kept to herself, rarely left her room, and had requested no housekeeping services. Brennan and Chen drove to the motel immediately. It was a single-story building with exterior doors facing a gravel parking lot. 12 rooms in total. The clerk pointed to room 7. Elena's silver Honda was parked directly in front. Brennan approached slowly, Chen covering from a distance. He knocked on the door, identifying himself as a police detective from Portland. There was silence. He knocked again, speaking softly, explaining that Elena was not in trouble, that they needed to talk to her about Derek. After nearly a minute, the door opened slightly, held by a security chain. Elena's face appeared in the gap, pale and exhausted. Her eyes were red from lack of sleep. She looked at Brennan's badge, then at Chen, standing near the patrol car. She asked if Derek had sent them. Brennan assured her that Derek was in custody, that he had been arrested, that he could not hurt her. Elena's expression shifted from fear to something like relief. She closed the door, unhooked the chain, and opened it fully. The motel room was sparse and dimly lit. Fast food containers were stacked on the small table near the window. Clothes were draped over a chair. Elena sat on the edge of the bed, her hands trembling. Brennan and Chen sat across from her, giving her space. They explained that they had been searching for her since she disappeared, that they knew she had found the tapes, that they understood she had been afraid. Elena began to cry, not from sadness but from the sheer weight of weeks spent in isolation and terror. She told them everything. How she had gone to the basement to check the dehumidifier, how she had found the box of tapes hidden beneath the workbench, how she had watched several of them, unable to believe what she was seeing, how she had realized the man she married was responsible for unspeakable crimes. She described the panic that had overtaken her, the certainty that if Derek found out she knew, he would kill her. She had left the house that night with no plan, only the instinct to survive. Elena explained that she had driven aimlessly for hours before checking into a motel near Portland. She had stayed there for 2 days, paralyzed by fear and indecision. She knew she should contact the police, but she was terrified of the consequences. What if they did not believe her? What if they thought she was involved? What if Derek somehow found out and came after her before they could arrest him? The fear had been overwhelming. On the third day, she had decided to leave Oregon entirely. She drove north into Washington, stopping in small towns where she could pay cash and avoid attention. She withdrew money from her savings account in small amounts, never enough to trigger alerts. She changed motels every few days, always using false names. She cut her hair short and dyed it darker. She avoided using her phone, knowing it could be traced. She lived in a state of constant vigilance, jumping at every sound, suspecting every stranger. She had not known that Derek had been arrested until this moment. She had avoided news coverage, too afraid to draw attention by asking questions. The isolation had been maddening, but she had convinced herself it was necessary for survival. Now, learning that Derek was in custody, that the police had found the tapes, that the victims were being identified, she felt a complicated mixture of emotions: relief that it was over, guilt that she had not come forward sooner, shame that she had run instead of fighting. Brennan listened without interruption. When Elena finished, he explained what had happened since her disappearance, how the tapes had been found, how Derek had been arrested and charged with multiple murders, how investigators had identified 3 victims and were working to identify more. He told her that her testimony would be crucial to the prosecution, that her account of finding the tapes and fleeing in fear would help establish Derek's guilt and demonstrate his threat to others. Elena asked about the women in the tapes. Brennan gave her the names of the 3 identified victims: Iris Coleman, Nora Vance, Pauline Grant. Elena repeated the names quietly, as if committing them to memory. She asked if there was anything she could have done differently, if she could have saved them. Brennan told her that Derek's crimes had been committed years before she found the tapes, that there was nothing she could have done to prevent what had already happened. But by coming forward now, she could help ensure justice for those women and prevent Derek from ever hurting anyone again. Elena agreed to return to Portland and provide a full statement. But before they left Olympia, she had one request. She asked if there was any evidence in the house beyond the tapes, anything that might prove Derek's guilt even more definitively. Brennan told her about the basement room, the camera setup, the forensic evidence collected. Elena's expression grew distant. She said there was something else, something she had not told them yet. Before leaving the house that December night, before fleeing in panic, Elena had done something impulsive. She had gone back down to the basement one final time. She had opened the cabinet where Derek kept his cleaning supplies, and she had found a locked metal box hidden behind the bottles of bleach. She had broken the lock with a screwdriver and looked inside. What she found were driver's licenses, identification cards belonging to women who were not her. She had not taken the box with her, had not thought clearly enough in that moment. She had simply closed the cabinet and left. But if it was still there, it would provide undeniable proof of Derek's victims. Brennan immediately contacted the forensic team in Portland. Within hours, they returned to the Hartman house and searched the basement cabinet. The metal box was exactly where Elena described. Inside were 11 driver's licenses and identification cards, each belonging to a different woman. 3 of them matched the already identified victims. The other 8 provided names and faces for victims who had not yet been connected to the case. It was the breakthrough investigators needed. Elena's decision to come forward, her detailed account of discovering the tapes, and her revelation about the hidden box of identification cards transformed the investigation. The case against Derek Hartman was no longer based solely on the disturbing footage found in his basement. There was now direct testimony from someone who had lived with him, who had discovered his crimes, and who could explain to a jury exactly what she had found and why she had fled in fear. The prosecution finally had the pieces they needed. March 2008. 15 months after Elena Hartman discovered the tapes that shattered her life, Derek Hartman's trial began in the Multnomah County Circuit Court in downtown Portland. The case had garnered intense media attention throughout the Pacific Northwest. Camera crews lined the courthouse steps. Reporters jostled for position in the gallery. Family members of the victims sat in reserved seating, some holding photographs of their lost loved ones. The weight of what was about to unfold hung heavy in the courtroom. Derek Hartman was charged with 3 counts of aggravated murder in the first degree for the deaths of Iris Coleman, Nora Vance, and Pauline Grant. Additional charges included kidnapping, assault, and evidence tampering. The prosecution had made a strategic decision to focus on these 3 cases initially, as they had the strongest evidence and clearest connection to Derek's activities. The other victims identified through the driver's licenses were part of ongoing investigations that could lead to future charges. The lead prosecutor was Deputy District Attorney Catherine Morrison, a veteran trial lawyer known for her meticulous preparation and controlled courtroom presence. She had spent over a year building the case, coordinating with investigators across multiple jurisdictions, reviewing thousands of pages of evidence, and preparing witnesses for testimony. Her opening statement was direct and methodical. She told the jury they would see evidence that was difficult to witness, but necessary to understand the scope of Derek Hartman's crimes. Morrison outlined the prosecution's case systematically. She explained how Derek had used his position as an IT technician to gain access to locations where he could identify and surveil potential victims. She described the basement room he had constructed in his own home, designed specifically for the purpose of committing violent acts while recording them. She previewed the testimony they would hear from forensic experts, from investigators who had traced Derek's movements, and from Elena Hartman herself. The defense attorney was Roger Walsh, a public defender who had represented Derek since his arrest. Walsh faced an almost impossible task. The evidence against his client was overwhelming. The tapes existed. The basement room had been documented. The victims had been identified. Derek's DNA had been found at multiple relevant locations. There was no reasonable way to argue innocence. Instead, Walsh's strategy focused on mental state. In his opening statement, he suggested that Derek Hartman suffered from severe psychological disorders that had impaired his ability to understand the nature of his actions. He argued that Derek had been driven by compulsions he could not control, that he required treatment rather than punishment. The trial proceeded with witness testimony that painted a comprehensive picture of Derek's crimes. Forensic experts presented evidence collected from the basement room. They described the blood spatter patterns, the DNA matches, the tool marks that indicated sustained use of the space over several years. They showed photographs of the camera setup, the metal chair, the reinforced walls. Every detail was documented and explained with clinical precision. Investigators testified about tracing Derek's work schedule and cross-referencing it with the disappearances of the 3 victims. They presented security footage showing Derek at the grocery store where Iris Coleman worked on the night she vanished. They described finding his work records that placed him at the Tacoma apartment complex 2 days before Nora Vance disappeared. They explained how digital forensics had linked Derek to the online profile used to lure Pauline Grant to her death. Family members of the victims provided impact statements. Iris Coleman's mother described her daughter as a bright student with dreams of becoming a teacher. She spoke about the years of not knowing what had happened, of hoping against hope that Iris might still be alive somewhere. Learning the truth had been devastating, but at least now she could lay her daughter to rest. Nora Vance's sister talked about the void left by Nora's disappearance, how birthdays and holidays had become painful reminders of absence. Pauline Grant's father, elderly and frail, struggled through his testimony, describing how trusting his daughter had been, how she had believed people were fundamentally good. The most anticipated testimony came in the second week of the trial. Elena Hartman took the stand. She had spent the previous year in protective custody, relocated to an undisclosed location with a new identity. Returning to Portland for the trial required significant security measures. She entered the courtroom through a side door, escorted by 2 marshals. She looked different from the photographs that had been shown in media coverage. Her hair was shorter, her face thinner. The trauma of the past 15 months was evident. Morrison led Elena through her testimony carefully. Elena described her marriage to Derek, how normal it had seemed, how she had trusted him completely. She recounted the evening of December 14, 2006, going to the basement to check the dehumidifier, finding the box of tapes. Her voice remained steady as she described watching the footage, the horror of recognizing Derek in the recordings, the realization that she had been living with someone capable of such acts. She explained her decision to flee, the fear that had driven her to leave that night without contacting police. She described the week spent hiding in Washington, the constant anxiety, the isolation. She acknowledged that she wished she had come forward sooner, that perhaps if she had gone directly to police, the investigation could have moved faster. Morrison reassured her that her actions had been understandable given the circumstances, that many people in similar situations would have responded the same way. Walsh cross-examined Elena with caution. He could not attack her credibility too aggressively without alienating the jury. Instead, he focused on establishing that Elena had never witnessed Derek committing any crimes directly, that her knowledge came solely from the tapes. He suggested that she could not be certain the footage was authentic, that it might have been staged or edited. Elena responded firmly that the terror in those women's eyes had been real, that Derek's presence in the recordings was unmistakable, that nothing about what she saw had been staged. Walsh also questioned why Elena had not taken the box of tapes with her when she fled. If she truly believed they were evidence of crimes, why leave them behind? Elena explained that she had been in a state of panic, that her only thought had been to escape. She had assumed Derek would destroy the tapes once he realized she was gone. The fact that he had not, that he had left them sitting on the coffee table, suggested he had not anticipated police involvement until it was too late. The prosecution presented the 11 driver's licenses found in the locked metal box. Each one was entered into evidence, displayed on screens for the jury to see. 8 of them belonged to women who remained unidentified in terms of matched missing persons cases, but their presence in Derek's possession was damning. Morrison argued that these licenses represented additional victims, women whose families might still be searching for them, whose cases had gone cold because Derek Hartman had been careful and methodical in his crimes. Walsh attempted to introduce expert testimony about Derek's mental state. A psychiatrist hired by the defense testified that Derek exhibited signs of antisocial personality disorder, narcissistic tendencies, and possible dissociative episodes. The psychiatrist argued that Derek's actions were the result of psychological compulsions rather than calculated malice. However, on cross-examination, Morrison effectively dismantled this argument. She pointed out that Derek had held a steady job for years, maintained relationships, managed his finances, and planned his crimes with precision. These were not the actions of someone unable to distinguish right from wrong. These were the actions of someone who understood consequences and took steps to avoid them. The trial lasted 5 weeks. The jury heard from 37 witnesses. They reviewed hundreds of pieces of evidence. Throughout the proceedings, Derek sat at the defense table showing little emotion. He did not testify on his own behalf, following his attorney's advice. He avoided eye contact with Elena when she was on the stand. He showed no visible reaction when photographs of his victims were displayed. Closing arguments took place on a gray April morning. Morrison summarized the evidence methodically, walking the jury through each element of the charges. She emphasized that Derek Hartman had not acted on impulse. He had built a room specifically for these crimes. He had recorded them. He had kept trophies. These were the actions of someone who knew exactly what he was doing and chose to do it anyway. She asked the jury to deliver justice for Iris Coleman, Nora Vance, and Pauline Grant. Walsh made a final plea for consideration of Derek's mental state, asking the jury to find him guilty but mentally ill, a verdict that would result in treatment rather than life imprisonment. It was a weak closing, and Walsh knew it. The evidence was simply too strong. The jury deliberated for 2 days. On April 23, 2008, they returned with their verdict. The courtroom fell silent as the jury foreman stood to deliver the verdict. Judge Patricia Reynolds, who had presided over the trial with firm control, looked toward the 12 men and women who had spent 5 weeks hearing evidence that would likely haunt them for years. Derek Hartman remained seated at the defense table, his expression blank, his hands folded in front of him. Behind him in the gallery, family members of the victims held hands, bracing themselves for what was to come. On the charge of aggravated murder in the first degree for the death of Iris Coleman, the jury found Derek Hartman guilty. On the charge of aggravated murder in the first degree for the death of Nora Vance, guilty. On the charge of aggravated murder in the first degree for the death of Pauline Grant, guilty. The foreman continued through the additional charges. Kidnapping, guilty on all counts. Assault, guilty on all counts. Evidence tampering, guilty. The verdict was unanimous across every charge. Several people in the gallery began to cry. Iris Coleman's mother collapsed into the arms of her husband. Nora Vance's sister sat with her head bowed, shoulders shaking. Pauline Grant's father closed his eyes and whispered something that might have been a prayer. Derek Hartman showed no visible reaction. He simply stared straight ahead as the verdicts were read, his face an impassive mask. Judge Reynolds thanked the jury for their service and dismissed them. She scheduled the sentencing hearing for 3 weeks later, giving both sides time to prepare their arguments. As Derek was led out of the courtroom by bailiffs, reporters rushed from the gallery to file their stories. The verdicts were broadcast across news channels within minutes. Derek Hartman, the quiet IT technician from Portland, had been found guilty of 3 murders and would now face the possibility of spending the rest of his life in prison. The sentencing hearing took place on May 14, 2008. Oregon had abolished the death penalty in practice. Though it remained technically on the books, the prosecution sought 3 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, the harshest penalty available under state law. Morrison argued that Derek's crimes demonstrated such depravity, such calculated cruelty, that he could never be safely released into society. She pointed to the premeditation involved, the construction of the basement room, the methodical documentation of his acts. These were not crimes of passion but crimes of design. Walsh argued for concurrent sentences with the possibility of parole after 30 years. He reiterated his position that Derek suffered from mental illness and should receive treatment. He suggested that with proper psychiatric care, Derek might eventually be rehabilitated. It was an argument Walsh himself seemed to struggle to believe, and it landed with little impact in the courtroom. Judge Reynolds allowed victim impact statements before announcing her sentence. Iris Coleman's mother spoke first. She described Iris as a young woman full of potential, someone who had wanted to make a difference in the world. She talked about the years of anguish not knowing what had happened to her daughter, cycling between hope and despair. She said that knowing the truth was both a relief and a fresh wound. She looked directly at Derek and told him that while he had taken Iris's life, he had not destroyed her memory or the love her family carried for her. Nora Vance's sister spoke about the practical devastation of losing Nora. She had been the stable one in their family, the person everyone turned to for advice. Her absence had created a void that could never be filled. She said she hoped Derek would spend every remaining day of his life thinking about what he had taken from the world, about the futures he had stolen, about the families he had destroyed. Pauline Grant's father was too overcome with emotion to read his prepared statement. His son-in-law read it for him. The statement described Pauline's kindness, her willingness to see the best in people, her belief that everyone deserved compassion. It acknowledged that those same qualities had made her vulnerable to someone like Derek. The statement ended with a plea that Derek never be allowed to harm anyone else, that he be kept away from society permanently. Elena Hartman did not attend the sentencing hearing. She had returned to her protected location after testifying at the trial, but she had submitted a written statement that Morrison read aloud. Elena wrote about the betrayal she felt, about the violation of trust that came from discovering who Derek truly was. She described the ongoing trauma of knowing she had shared a home with someone capable of such acts. She expressed sympathy for the victims' families and guilt that she had not discovered the truth sooner. She ended by saying that she hoped the sentence would bring some measure of closure, though she acknowledged that true healing might never be possible for anyone touched by Derek's crimes. Judge Reynolds then delivered her sentence. She noted that she had reviewed all the evidence presented at trial, all the testimony, all the psychological evaluations. She stated that Derek Hartman's crimes represented a fundamental disregard for human life and dignity. The premeditation, the documentation, the collection of trophies, all pointed to someone who viewed his victims not as people, but as objects for his gratification. She said the court had an obligation to protect society from individuals who posed such a profound threat. She sentenced Derek Hartman to life in prison without the possibility of parole for the murder of Iris Coleman. She sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole for the murder of Nora Vance. She sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole for the murder of Pauline Grant. She ordered that these sentences be served consecutively, not concurrently. In practical terms, this meant Derek would die in prison. There would be no parole hearings, no chance for early release, no path back to freedom. For the additional charges of kidnapping and assault, she added 25 years to be served consecutively. The total sentence exceeded 100 years. Derek would be transferred to the Oregon State Penitentiary, where he would spend the remainder of his life in maximum security. Judge Reynolds concluded by stating that the sentence reflected the severity of the crimes and the need to ensure Derek Hartman would never harm another person. Derek was led from the courtroom for the final time. He would later be processed through the state correction system and assigned a permanent cell. His appeals would be filed automatically, as was standard procedure for life sentences, but legal experts agreed his chances of overturning the conviction were virtually non-existent. The evidence had been overwhelming, the trial conducted fairly, the verdict legally sound. Outside the courthouse, Deputy District Attorney Morrison held a press conference. She thanked the investigators who had worked tirelessly on the case, particularly Detective Brennan and the task force he had assembled. She acknowledged the courage of Elena Hartman in coming forward and testifying despite the personal cost. She expressed hope that the verdict and sentence would provide some measure of justice for the victims' families, though she recognized that nothing could truly compensate for their losses. Family members also spoke to the media. They thanked the prosecution team, the Portland Police Bureau, and the community for supporting them through the long investigation and trial. They expressed relief that Derek would never be free again, but acknowledged that the pain of their losses would persist. Several established victim advocacy organizations in honor of their loved ones, working to support other families dealing with similar tragedies. The impact of the Derek Hartman case extended beyond the courtroom. The Portland Police Bureau conducted an internal review of how missing persons cases were investigated and coordinated across jurisdictions. Detective Brennan advocated for improved database systems that would allow law enforcement agencies to identify patterns more quickly when multiple disappearances occurred in a region. Several of his recommendations were implemented in the years following the trial. The case also raised questions about how thoroughly background checks were conducted for positions that granted access to private spaces. The healthcare network that had employed Derek instituted new protocols for vetting technicians and required employees to work in pairs when entering residential buildings or private areas. Other companies across the region followed suit. Elena Hartman never returned to Portland. She remained in protective custody under her new identity, relocated to a location that was never disclosed publicly. According to statements released through her attorney, she eventually resumed teaching under her new name, finding solace in working with students again. She declined all interview requests and avoided any public discussion of the case. The trauma of what she had experienced, what she had discovered, required years of therapy to process. The 8 additional driver's licenses found in Derek's possession remained part of ongoing investigations. Over the following years, 3 of those women were identified through forensic genealogy and database searches. Their families were notified. Their cases, some of which had been cold for decades, were officially closed. The other 5 licenses belonged to women who remained unidentified, their real names and histories lost. Investigators continued working on those cases, hoping someday to give those women their identities back and their families closure. Derek Hartman adjusted to life in prison with the same quiet compliance he had shown throughout his trial. He followed the rules, caused no problems, and kept to himself. He declined interview requests from journalists and documentary filmmakers. He never expressed remorse for his crimes or provided information about additional victims. In the eyes of the justice system and the public, he remained exactly what the evidence had proven him to be, a methodical predator who had destroyed lives without conscience or hesitation. The case officially closed in 2009 when all appeals were exhausted and the sentence became final. For the families of Iris Coleman, Nora Vance, and Pauline Grant, justice had been served, though it could never restore what had been taken. For Elena Hartman, the end of the legal proceedings marked the beginning of a long journey toward rebuilding a life shattered by the discovery of unimaginable evil living under her own roof. The story of what happened in December 2006, when a woman found tapes that revealed her husband's darkest secrets, became a cautionary tale about how deeply hidden evil can be, how trust can be exploited, and how courage can emerge even in the most terrifying circumstances. It was a reminder that justice, while imperfect and incomplete, remains essential for society to function and for victims to find any measure of peace.